Hi there. I don't know if you've noticed, but every city in the world has its share of monuments. Structures or statues that have been built to commemorate people or events that have taken place in the past. And my home city of Auckland here in New Zealand is absolutely no different. In the centre of the city, this beautiful place, Cornwall Park, and in the centre of the park, a dormant volcano, known by the locals and by the famous U2 song, is One Tree Hill. And on the summit, this rather imposing obelisk, built to commemorate the achievements and the character of the Maori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand. Buried at the foot of this tower is the gentleman who bought much of the land around here, established the park, and then gifted it to the newly formed city of Auckland. And he established in his will that this great obelisk should be built and that his grave would be at its foot. Sir John Logan Campbell died in 1912. Not that long ago, really, because New Zealand's a young country. Obelisk? I reckon he got the idea from somewhere else. I reckon these guys might have got the idea from somebody else too. And this is where I reckon they got the idea from. Built by Ramses the Great around 1250 BC. There used to be two of them, one this side and one the other. The other one's been taken to Paris for some reason. And these two were exquisitely constructed so that on the longest day and the shortest day of the year, the sun would transit between the two of them. Incredible, eh? There is one older obelisk than this, the Al Masala obelisk in the Heliopolis district north of Cairo, built around 1936 BC. All around the world there are monuments and structures built to commemorate people now since long dead. But no one else can claim to have split time in half, before and after. BC AD, before Christ, Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of our Lord. Absolutely incredible. This church is one of the oldest continually operating churches in the world. I mean, seriously, how cool is that? And it's here because it's where tradition has it Jesus Christ was born. And this particular church was built in 575 AD, but it's not the original. It was built by Justinian I as a rebuild after the first one burnt down in 326 AD. I'd like to read you a quote. Leading historian and theologian N.T. Wright says, "There's really no doubt that Jesus was born here in Bethlehem. There are numerous historical references to the point that even Bart Ehrman, a secular agnostic scholar, wrote these words: He certainly existed, as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees." The fact is, we have not one but four eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. These are known as the four Gospels, the accounts written by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And of course there are also secular accounts. Listen to these words from Edwin Yamauchi. Even if we did not have the New Testament or Christian writings, we would be able to conclude from such non-Christian writings as Josephus, the Talmud, Tacitus and Pliny the Younger that Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Many people believed that he performed healings and exorcisms. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Despite this shameful death, his followers, who believed that he was still alive, spread beyond Palestine so that there were multitudes of them in Rome by AD 64. All kinds of people from the cities and the countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshipped him as God by the beginning of the 2nd century. So you can see from that clearly, from sources both secular and sacred, Jesus was a real person. Tell you what, while we're here, let's go look at something. We're now heading off into the basement of the church, and we're going to see the whole reason why it exists. You see, in the time of Jesus, the houses around here were built in front of caves. It was really sensible. The animals were in the cave at the back and the house in the front. And that was the situation with where Jesus was born. And tradition has it that this is the spot. In front of a cave, this church is built over and around it, where Jesus was born, and this star, tradition has it, marks the spot. Now what people do is they come here, bend down, and kiss the star. And simply because that many people have kissed it, I don't think I will, but I will have a little look. After Jesus was born, he was picked up, wrapped, and put in a manger. And again, tradition has it that this is where the manger is. So this ancient church is here to preserve a very special site, a site where Jesus, the Son of God, was born. To be honest, this place is a little bit annoying as far as I'm concerned, because it's beautiful architecture. And the reason it's here, the reason this beautiful architecture is here, is that it's built over these little caves that are down in this hollow here that we're about to get to. And these caves are a bit special, although they're now covered over by this very modern church. See, these caves used to house olive oil, grain, wine, and actually they used to house a certain carpenter's workshop, a man called Joseph, stepfather of Jesus. And now all this stuff has been built around it. And I'd far rather have seen them as they were, because then I could imagine Jesus as a little boy playing here, running around, being sent on errands, helping out in the workshop, grazing his knee, doing all the little boy stuff right here in Nazareth in Israel. You know, I said I was a bit annoyed about this church being here, but then I remind myself that humanity is incurably religious. And I guess it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, that if someone split history in two, BC and AD, you'd erect a monument to celebrate that person's birth and childhood. That's what these churches are, monuments to Jesus, celebrations of his greatness. There's a good reason why Jesus was born a Jew here in Israel and not in some other country. Because Jesus was destined to be Israel's Messiah. Just like that first promise made way back in Genesis and then disclosed more and more through the Old Testament, God promised that one day he would send someone to crush Satan's head and fix the problems that sin had made. And that someone would come through the line of Abraham, that someone would be a Jew. So here we have Jesus ticking every box, fulfilling every prophecy. Jewish mother, Mary, born in Bethlehem, lived in Nazareth, directly descended from King David,
who was descended from Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham. That's right. Jesus is a direct descendant of Abraham, the man who became the father of the Jews, the nation that God had called to be a living billboard to tell the world about the one true God. The nation through whom he would bless the whole world.
In the New Testament, the disciple John wrote his book to not only show that Jesus was descended from the line of Abraham, but that he was also Israel's Messiah. And he opens it with these incredible words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then a bit later on, to make even more sense of that, he says, and the Word became flesh and lived with us. John's packed a huge amount into just a few words. When he's saying the Word became flesh, he's making it, or trying to make it really clear that he's talking about Jesus. Jesus is the Word. That this person born in Bethlehem had actually come from God to be with us on earth.
Think about it, it's just incredible. When God began making the universe, Jesus was already there. He already was. And if he was there when the universe began, he was obviously there before it began. And John tells us that Jesus was involved in making the universe. In fact, nothing was made without him. And then to remove all doubt, John says that not only was the Word with God, but astonishingly he says the Word, Jesus, was God. What John is clearly saying is that Jesus the Messiah is actually God. John carries on to say, He, God, became flesh and lived among us. That has to be one of the most astonishing events the universe has ever seen. The God who always was, who made everything, became flesh, born as a baby.
And this is one of the greatest mysteries, how God could become a human being. All very good, you might say. Big claims, huge claims. We're being presented with Jesus as being fully human and God, miraculous birth, and now living in the middle of the very people that he himself has made. Almost too much, almost sounds crazy, but it doesn't stop there. Jesus himself claimed to be God. In John chapter 10, verse 30, he says, "The Father and I are one." Well, to the Jews listening, that so infuriated them, him claiming to be God, that they picked up rocks to stone him to death. Jesus didn't stop there. He then went on to claim that he could forgive sin, and everybody knew only God could do that. Now, if it were true that Jesus was God, you would expect him to be absolutely perfect, not just some run-of-the-mill, ordinary type of guy. And try as they might, Jesus' enemies, and man, he had a fair few of those, they couldn't find a single fault, a single flaw in him. This guy was absolutely perfect.
In John chapter 8, verse 46, Jesus asked them, "Can any of you prove me guilty of sin?" And no one responded, though they surely wanted to. The Bible also tells us that Jesus did a huge number of what are called miracles, things that don't happen unless God intervenes, things that only God can do. And these miracles were a way of demonstrating that Jesus had the power of God. They showed that God was endorsing both Jesus and his message. Interestingly enough, miracles were not new to Israel. There was more than one episode of them happening in Israel's history. You can find them scattered throughout the Old Testament. But when it comes to Jesus, things seem to step up to a different level. He not only does miracles, he does hundreds and hundreds of them. Let's take a look.
In Jesus' time, this area, Capernaum, was a bustling village of around about 1,500 people. Most of them were fishermen out here on the Sea of Galilee, and the rest of them over here farming the very fertile land just behind. And as Jesus was walking around here, a remarkable thing began to happen. Well, let's read about it. Jesus went all over Galilee, teaching in the Jewish meeting places and preaching the good news about God's kingdom. He also healed every kind of disease and sickness. So news about him spread all over Syria, and people with every kind of sickness or disease were brought to him. Some of them had a lot of demons in them, others were thought to be crazy, and still others could not walk. But Jesus healed them all. Wow, I mean, imagine it. If you had anything wrong with you, what would you do? And that's what happened. People came flooding in from all over the place, from all around Galilee. And the Bible says they were even coming from Jerusalem, from Judea, even as far away as the Jordan River, flooding in to this man who could heal. And there were many, many other miracles as well. For instance, one night out there on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus was being rowed from this side to the other. And he was tired and he'd fallen asleep in the boat, a very human thing to do. And the guys rowing, his disciples, were getting more and more worried as the wind got up and the waves got up. They thought the boat was going to sink. So they woke Jesus up, and he stood up and, talking to the storm, said, "Be still." And immediately it was, just like that. Well, we're here at Bethany, and this is Lazarus' tomb. Another time, Jesus was told that his great friend Lazarus was sick. And by the time Jesus got here, where Lazarus lived, he'd died 4 days previously and been buried in this tomb. Jesus wept, a very human response. And he said to the people, "Roll the stone away." And they said, "Why? Why would we do that? He's been dead 4 days, it'll smell." Jesus said, "Roll the stone away." Stone gets rolled away. Jesus calls out, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus got up, all wrapped up in the grave clothes, and walked out. The dead man had come back to life. Of course, people were flocking to see this man. He was doing amazing things. But there was more to it than that. Much, much more. You see, the Jewish people were looking for something. They'd been promised someone, a special person, a Messiah, mentioned in the Old Testament prophecies. So, of course, they were looking at all of this and saying, could this be the one? Is this who we've been waiting for? Is this the person of promise? And two things led them to think that that might be the case. He was doing all this amazing stuff, miracles. But it was more than that, because people had done miracles in Israel's history before, and they weren't the Messiah. It was more that the type of miracles he was doing showed that here was a person, a Messiah, who had the ability to change the world. So the question we've got to ask ourselves, if he was a fraud, would God have given him all that power to do just so many amazing miracles? Or could he actually be the one, the true Messiah?
This is the remnant of an ancient wall that surrounded the Jewish temple's courtyard in the time of Jesus. The wall was started by Herod the Great in 19 BC, but not finished until after his lifetime. This was part of a large expansion project that Herod undertook on the Temple Mount that would have been occurring while Jesus was living here. This wall was part of Herod's extension of the platform that the temple stood on. The New Testament tells us that when Jesus went into the temple and spoke, the people were amazed at his authority and understanding. The leaders and scholars of the day were astonished at his wisdom.
He was so impressive that the intellectual elite, the religious leaders of the time, came to him one day when he was down here at the Western Wall here, crowd of people around them, to ask a question that they'd been cooking up for some time. And the question was a real doozy, a good one. It was, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Just to explain that a little bit, if he answered yes, then he was seen to be going on side with the Romans who were occupying the country. If he said no, well then he was rebelling against the people who were in authority in that country, and so he wasn't doing the right thing then either. So this was the trick that they were trying to put in front of him. So they came and they launched their question. And the New Testament says that what he did next was absolutely stunning. Jesus turned to the crowd that was pressing in now to hear this answer all around them. He says, anybody got a coin? And somebody produced one, possibly like this. And he held it up. And he said, tell me whose image is on this coin, whose inscription. And I imagine as one, they all yelled out, Caesar's! And of course they were right. It is Caesar's. His answer was stunning. Crowd in, and Jesus says, well then, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And the New Testament says they were completely awestruck and amazed. Whatever he taught on, authority, money, the rich, the poor, love, hate, marriage, all of it, people were astonished by what he said. And that's no surprise, because the authority and wisdom he had was coming direct from God, his Father. And earlier on, God had said, this is my son, listen to him. And as we saw at the beginning, there is no doubt that Jesus is a historical figure. But he's not only real, he made such an impact that he split time in half. So no matter what we think of him, we can't doubt that he was here, that he existed. And we also saw that he made extraordinary claims, that he was the Messiah, that he was both God and man. And we also saw that by claiming to be God and doing miracles, he proved that what he said was true.
We started here at a monument to a man most of you will never have heard of. And yet to this day, the obelisk towers over the city where he lived. And we ended talking about the extraordinary life of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And yes, there are buildings and objects in Jesus' name all around the globe, churches and shrines built over the last 2,000 years. But you know what? Maybe his legacy isn't in those buildings and shrines. Maybe his legacy is in the words that he left us. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. Words that are still ringing around this globe 2,000 years later.
Well, we've seen in this episode that Jesus is a real person. Jesus made incredible claims. Jesus lived a sinless life. Jesus did amazing miracles. Jesus was a great teacher. Now, you've got to admit, that's a pretty impressive resume. But here's the thing. It's not a resume you can just glance at from a distance and then put away in a drawer and ignore. It's the kind of resume that grabs your attention and doesn't let you look away. That's because Jesus' works and his words, his miracles and his teachings are without parallel
unique in history. And that means that each one of us in our own way has to wrestle with the question, what are we to make of him? You know, when it comes to Jesus, we really only have four options. We could say Jesus is just a legend, a myth. But the life and death of Jesus is well-attested historical fact, recorded not just by the gospel writers, but by secular historians as well. Or we could say that Jesus was a lunatic, and yet we never see him emotionally or mentally unhinged. Far from it, he constantly amazes both his friends and his enemies with his calmness under pressure, with his deep insight, with his wisdom. We might even try to write Jesus off as a liar, but clearly, if he'd told even one lie, his enemies would have exposed that immediately. It seems there's only one real option, and that is to face the evidence and acknowledge Jesus for who he is, Lord. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, if Jesus is Lord, then those words of his can't be wrong. No one comes to the Father except through me. And in the next episode, we're going to see why that is true.